that Aristotle says is actually quite explicitly in the Anima. So therefore, they're only sort of vaguely in one's mind, but not in reality, united through the term Trinity, but they are really all apart from each other. That now was the heresy of tritheism that became rampant in Syria, and I mentioned here on the bottom, this is just in passing that I want to mention this, the monks in Syria were now deeply split. So the Jacobite monophysites were deeply split between regular monophysitism, which was one of the so-called heresies, and which relies on the on a particular definition of what the nature of Jesus is. I will not go into this; it's not necessary for our purposes here. And then there were lots of monks in the same monasteries, because monasteries dotted the landscape of Syria, who professed this tritheism. So because of this split, and probably there were furious discussions among these monks, are the members of Trinity substances, or are the members of Trinity just manifestations or aspects, so to speak? Furious discussions, we can assume, in these monasteries. And so the Archimandrites, as the documents refer to, they were actually the abbots of these monasteries, were very concerned about these splits among their monks in these monasteries. And they wrote to their respective bishops, help us, what can we do in all of this? And we unfortunately don't know the answer, but that must have been a situation of high anxiety toward the end of the 700s. And so, given this particular situation, there was on top of that also then a schism in the Jacobite or Monophysite church hierarchy, with one of the bishops, Damien of Alexandria, who was accused by his opponent, Peter of Callinicum. Callinicum, by the way, was at that time the name for Raqqa. That, of course, is the eastern Syrian city that was recently reconquered from ISIS, if you want to locate this geographically. I will show you a map in a moment. So they accused each other, these two bishops, of horrible heresies, Sabellianism, which is a much earlier heresy in the late 200s, early 300s, according to which Jesus was not divine, but merely an adopted figure of high spiritual standing. So he was accused of that particular heresy. And then the important point, Peter of Callinicum was accused of tritheism. De facto, he was not a tritheist, but that's not important. Tritheism continued right into the early 600s, when finally then the schism was ended. And tritheism then probably faded from the scene, but not quite. And that's the whole point of my departure then for Islamic origins. Because, let me see one more point, briefly. Because this conflict between regular Jacobites, so the Monophysite so-called heresy, and then the split within the Jacobites represented by this tritheists, that then was visible among the Arabs who were under a vice-regent, a so-called phylarch. These were commanders in the name of Byzantium or Eastern Rome, responsible for the defenses of the borders of the Roman Empire against the Persians. And the desert border was therefore then the border where the nomadic Arabs were enrolled as allies of the Byzantines in order to help protect it. And they were called the Ghassanids. And you have the spelling here. The Ghassanid phylarch, who was the leader of the Western Arabs, or one of them, this Jaffna al-Ghassan, actually tried to end this schism among these bishops so that this whole tritheist episode would somehow be put aside or overcome, so that regular monophysitism would return to the land. However, Jaffna was no longer very powerful, and so he failed then in his efforts to reconcile, and the schism continued, because by now power really had passed to other Arabs, whom I describe as Eastern Arabs. And so let's go on. Let me quickly now show you on the map what we are talking about. Here is the center of the province of Arabia. That was where these Ghassanids resided. But they governed, actually, this entire area, which we can call the Syrian steppe and desert. Let me show you now in the following map how far this Ghassanid territory extended. You can see quite a bit into the direction of Baghdad and Mesopotamia. And here now we will see the Ghassanid kingdom that was deputy to defend the eastern border of Rome against now Eastern Arabs who were deputied by the Persian king, or king of kings, Shah in Shah, for the defense of Persia against Rome. And they were the Lakhmids, whom you see here as the adjacent territory. So in the 500s, the Romans and the Persians had already gone to war against each other several times. Generally, the Romans were victorious, but usually the Persians were able to come back. And of course, they used their vice regents, those of the Ghassanids and of the Lakhmids, as allies to fight the war for them in the desert here in the southern part of Syria. So here, roughly here. And so now a few words about the Lakhmids. The Lakhmids now were the eastern or part of the Eastern Arabs, and in their quote king, or equivalent of Phylarch among the Ghassanids, converted in 594 to Nestorian Christianity. Now, Nestorian Christianity is a Christian church. I mentioned this already briefly, that believes in the two equal natures of Jesus. So Jesus was equally human, so he was fully human, but he was also, of course, God, because God, in the interpretation of the theology of the 500s, was also Jesus, in the sense that in terms of Trinity and how it was represented, he represented God coming to earth in order to bring salvation to humans. By contrast, the Monophysites believed in a primarily divine Jesus who took on the flesh of humans when he came to earth, but was, let's say, 3/4 divine, 1/4 human. So you can see here that was a real contrast over which you could go to war and could kill each other if it came really to blows. And then on top of that, you had the schism within the schism, that there was somebody who stood up and said, well, when we talk about Trinity, we have to talk about 3 different gods. So you can see the enormous amount of conflict that existed in Christianity. Now, he converted to Nestorianism, and then one of the sources says, once he had converted, that he chased the Jacobites from the provinces. So in other words, only Nestorians now remained in the east, among the Eastern Arabs. All the Jacobites, all the Monophysites now were pushed back into Ghassanid territory, or even further south into Egypt. And now the Eastern Arabs had established their form of Christianity as dominant in the eastern steppe. Now, unfortunately, however, as it had so happened with the Ghassanids, but there it had happened already in 580, both the Roman emperor and now also the Persian king in the early 600s decided that these vice regents in the desert, who were the commanders of the Arabs to fight this supplementary war, so to speak, between the Romans and the Persians, that they were expendable. They had maybe grown a little too strong for their appointed positions. And so, I mentioned already, the Ghassanids had been reduced around 580. Now, the Persian king went a step further. He had his king, who was supposed to defend the border against the Romans, assassinated outright. And so that was the end of the Eastern Arabs in the city of Hira, which is on the western fringes of the Persian Empire. And as I said,